Maya walks into a convenience store, only to find herself unfairly watched by Emily, a store employee. As Emily silently follows her every move, convinced that Maya is up to no good, a real theft unfolds right under her nose. Faced with a moral dilemma, Maya chooses to report the theft, but the real suspense lies in the aftermath. Will Emily recognize the truth behind her actions, or will this cycle of prejudice continue? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Maya pushed open the glass door to the store, the familiar bell jingling overhead. It wasn't a special kind of store, just a small convenience shop in a quiet neighborhood, one where people came and went without much fuss. The shelves were lined with the usual items: snacks, drinks, household products, and a small refrigerated section in the back. But despite its ordinary appearance, the store had an atmosphere Maya couldn't quite shake. There was something about it that made her feel uneasy, though she couldn't immediately pinpoint why. She tugged at the sleeves of her worn-out hoodie, pulling them over her wrists as she stepped further inside. The aisles stretched out before her, and for a moment she considered turning around and leaving. But she wasn't going to let an unfounded feeling stop her. After all, it was just a quick trip to grab something before heading home. She could almost hear her mother's voice in her head, reminding her not to let paranoia creep into her mind. Maya walked slowly down the first aisle, her fingers trailing along the shelves as she scanned the snacks. She wasn't in any rush, but a sense of discomfort grew with every step. She felt it. Eyes on her. At first, she tried to brush it off. It was probably just her imagination, that nagging voice she had grown up with, telling her that she was always being watched, always being judged. But when she glanced up from a pack of chips, she caught the gaze of a store employee, Emily, watching her from the counter. Emily's expression wasn't overtly hostile, but it wasn't warm either. Her eyes lingered on Maya longer than they should have, and the tightness around her mouth betrayed a kind of wariness. Maya tried not to let it get to her. She wasn't doing anything wrong, just shopping like any other customer. Yet, the unspoken accusation in Emily's stare followed her from aisle to aisle. She picked up a bottle of water, her eyes darting back toward the counter where Emily still stood, her arms crossed and her gaze unwavering. The feeling of being followed, of being scrutinized, tightened like a coil inside Maya's chest. This wasn't the first time she had experienced something like this. Being followed in stores was an all-too-common occurrence, and she had learned to let it roll off her back. But today, it was harder to ignore. Maya's fingers gripped the bottle of water a little too tightly, and she exhaled slowly, trying to release the tension building inside her. She knew why Emily was watching her. It wasn't because Maya had done anything suspicious. It was simply because of how she looked. The color of her skin had, once again, made her a target of someone's quiet, unspoken judgment. Emily, on the other hand, didn't think of herself as a bad person. She was just doing her job, keeping an eye on the customers, making sure nothing went missing. Mr. Howard, the store's owner, had always emphasized the importance of vigilance, especially since the store had experienced a few shoplifting incidents over the years. Emily had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, something about Maya didn't sit right with her. Maybe it was the hoodie. Maybe it was the way she was moving through the store. But something made her think she needed to keep watching this girl. As Maya moved to the next aisle, Emily shifted slightly from her position behind the counter, her movements small and careful, trying to keep herself in the girl's peripheral vision. She didn't want to make it obvious that she was following her, but at the same time, she felt compelled to stay close. Better safe than sorry. Raya could feel Emily's presence even though she couldn't see her. It was like a shadow, looming over her, darkening the space around her. She grabbed a small bag of pretzels and tossed it into the basket she was carrying, her jaw clenched tightly as she tried to stay calm. She didn't want to cause a scene. She didn't want to give anyone any reason to think she was overreacting. But the tension in the store was growing thicker by the minute, and Maya could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Another customer walked in, the bell chiming overhead again. A teenage boy with a hoodie pulled low over his head. He moved quickly, not making eye contact with anyone, and headed straight for the back of the store. Maya barely noticed him. She was too focused on shaking off the feeling of being watched. But Emily noticed him. She saw him out of the corner of her eye, but her attention didn't waver from Maya. The air felt heavy as Maya finally made her way to the counter. She placed her basket down with a quiet thud, glancing at Emily, who was already reaching for the items. Their eyes met briefly, and Maya could see the suspicion still lurking there, just beneath the surface. She fought the urge to say something, to call out the injustice she felt bubbling up inside her, but instead, she remained silent. She had learned that speaking up in situations like this rarely made a difference. It only made things worse. Emily rang up the items with swift, mechanical movements, her eyes never leaving Maya's face. The transaction was over in less than a minute, and Maya paid in cash, her hand steady, even though she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. As she collected her items and turned to leave, she couldn't help but glance back one more time. Emily was still watching her, her expression unreadable but cold. Maya pushed open the door, the bell chiming once again as she stepped outside. The cold air hit her face, a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. She exhaled deeply, feeling the tension begin to melt away. But as she walked down the sidewalk, she couldn't shake the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. It wasn't fair. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she had been treated like a criminal simply because of who she was. The injustice of it gnawed at her, but she knew there was nothing she could do. This was just the way things were. People like Emily would always exist, people who saw her not for who she was, but for what they assumed she could be. It was exhausting, but Maya had learned long ago that there was no point in fighting it. All she could do was move on and hope that one day things might be different. Emily watched as Maya left the store, the door shutting behind her with a soft jingle. She stood there for a moment, the items from the next customer still in her hand, her mind buzzing. There was a weight in the pit of her stomach, a strange unease she couldn't quite place. Sure, the girl hadn't done anything wrong, but something about her had triggered Emily's instincts. And in Emily's mind, instincts were never wrong. She glanced down at the next customer's items and began ringing them up mechanically, her thoughts lingering on Maya. It was an odd feeling, this knot of tension that hadn't dissipated even after the girl had left. Emily prided herself on being a good judge of character, someone who could sense when something was off, and today, something had definitely been off. As she worked, her mind wandered to previous incidents in the store. Over the past few years, they had faced a handful of thefts. Sometimes it was teenagers, sometimes adults, and sometimes people who looked just like Maya. Those incidents had left a mark on Emily, making her wary of certain behaviors. Or maybe, deep down, it wasn't the behaviors she was wary of, it was the people who exhibited them. Her hands paused for a moment as she realized where her thoughts were going, and a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. She pushed it away quickly. No, she wasn't like that. She wasn't someone who judged people just by how they looked. She was just careful, that's all. In today's world, you couldn't be too careful. She finished ringing up the next customer and smiled stiffly as they left, the knot in her stomach tightening. But now, she couldn't shake the memory of Maya's expression, calm, controlled, but there had been something else there, too. Something Emily had overlooked in her determination to follow her instincts. Was it hurt? Disappointment? Anger? Emily didn't know, and part of her didn't want to dwell on it. She had a job to do, and it wasn't her job to worry about every person's feelings. Still, the image of Maya's face stayed with her, and as the hours ticked by and the flow of customers slowed, Emily found herself thinking back to her first few days at the store. It had been years ago, but the lessons Mr. Howard had drilled into her head were still fresh. Keep your eyes open. Be alert. You never know what people are up to, he had told her. Mr. Howard had been running the store for decades, and he'd seen it all. His words came from a place of experience, and Emily had taken them to heart. Back then, she was eager to prove herself, to show that she could be trusted with responsibility. She was young, fresh out of high school, and working at the store was one of her first real jobs. She remembered feeling proud when Mr. Howard had complimented her vigilance after she spotted a man trying to slip a candy bar into his jacket. It wasn't much, but it felt like she had done something important. That memory made her feel justified, as though her actions today had been nothing out of the ordinary. Just another instance of staying sharp, being cautious. But as the quiet moments stretched on and the clock on the wall inched toward closing time, the doubt began to creep back in. She wandered over to one of the aisles to straighten the shelves, hoping the task would distract her. But as she placed items neatly back in their rows, her mind kept circling back to Maya. What if she had been wrong? What if the girl really had just come in to buy a snack, like any other customer? The thought nagged at her, and she tried to shove it aside, but it clung to her stubbornly. It wasn't like Emily was a bad person. She was just careful. That's what she kept telling herself. But then, a memory from her own childhood surfaced, something she hadn't thought about in years. Emily had been 12, shopping with her mother at a different convenience store. They were in the cereal aisle when a store employee started following them. Emily hadn't noticed at first, but her mother had. She remembered the way her mother's face had tightened, the way she had whispered sharply to Emily to put the cereal box down. They had left the store quickly, her mother's hand gripping hers tightly, not saying a word until they were in the car. "What happened, Mom?" Emily had asked, her voice small. "They thought we were stealing," her mother had replied, her voice full of an anger Emily didn't understand at the time. "They always think we're stealing." Emily hadn't understood the weight of those words back then, but now, standing in the quiet store, she felt the memory rush back with a clarity that made her stomach twist. Her mother had been furious, but also hurt, wounded by the assumption that they, as a family who looked different from most in their town, were more likely to be thieves. And now, years later, Emily realized with a sinking feeling that she had done the same thing to Maya. She stopped rearranging the shelves and leaned against the counter, her arms crossed, staring into space. It was an uncomfortable feeling, this realization. It didn't sit well with her because it wasn't who she thought she was. Emily had always prided herself on being fair, on treating people equally. And yet today, she had fallen into the same trap that so many others had. She had judged someone based on nothing more than a gut feeling, a feeling she now suspected was less about instinct and more about preconceived notions. The bell above the door chimed again, pulling Emily from her thoughts. It was Mr. Howard, coming back from his break. He gave her a nod and shuffled toward the back, oblivious to the turmoil swirling in her mind. Emily watched him go, her hands gripping the counter a little too tightly. She wanted to talk to him, to ask him if she had done the right thing. But she knew what he would say. Mr. Howard would probably pat her on the back and tell her she did well, that she had been smart to keep an eye on Maya. After all, she hadn't stolen anything. And that was the whole point, wasn't it? To prevent something from happening? But even as she tried to rationalize it, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed a line today. A line she didn't even realize she was crossing until it was too late. That night, when the store closed and the lights dimmed, Emily walked home with her hands stuffed in her jacket pockets, her thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and frustration. She had been raised better than this. Her mother had always taught her to see people for who they were, not for what society made them out to be. But somewhere along the way, Emily had forgotten that lesson. Or maybe she had just been too eager to follow Mr. Howard's lead, too willing to assume the worst in people because it was easier than confronting her own biases. As she rounded the corner to her apartment building, Emily stopped and looked up at the sky. The stars were barely visible through the haze of the city, but the cool night air helped to clear her mind a little. She took a deep breath, wondering if she would see Maya again. And if she did, would she act differently? Would she be able to look the girl in the eye and not see her as a potential threat? Emily didn't know, but she hoped she would. In the end, all she could do was promise herself that next time she would try to do better. Maya's footsteps echoed softly on the pavement as she left the store behind her. The sky had begun to darken, casting long shadows across the street, but the cold air felt strangely refreshing after the suffocating atmosphere inside. She adjusted the strap of her backpack and walked with purpose, her thoughts swirling with frustration. The experience in the store wasn't new, but it never failed to sting. It wasn't just about Emily's watchful eyes or the subtle judgment that had followed Maya through each aisle. It was the constant reminder that no matter what she did, where she went, or how she behaved, someone would always assume the worst about her. Today, it was Emily. Tomorrow, it could be someone else. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her, and though she'd long grown used to it, the pressure never really eased. She glanced at the small bag in her hand, the bottle of water, the pretzels. The mundane nature of her purchase contrasted so starkly with the tension she had felt inside the store. It seemed ridiculous. What could anyone possibly think she was stealing? A few snacks? A drink? Yet the suspicion in Emily's eyes had been unmistakable. As she walked, Maya's mind replayed the moment when she'd seen the teenage boy in the hoodie slip into the store. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but something about the way he moved had caught her attention. He had been quiet, too quiet, like he was trying not to be noticed. She had seen enough people like him, nervous, eyes darting around, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Maya stopped suddenly, standing at the corner of the block, her mind racing. She had been so wrapped up in her own frustrations that she hadn't thought twice about the boy in the store. Could he have been planning to steal something? The thought unsettled her. Here she was, stewing over being unfairly judged, and yet she might have overlooked something real. She turned back, looking in the direction of the store. The lights were still on, and she could just make out the shadow of a few customers inside. For a brief moment, Maya considered going back, pushing open the door and telling Emily what she had noticed. But then she hesitated. Why should she? Why should she help someone who had just treated her like a criminal without any reason? The injustice of it gnawed at her. It wasn't her job to fix things. She shouldn't have to go out of her way to make up for someone else's prejudice. Yet, despite her anger, something tugged at her conscience. If she didn't say anything, and the boy did steal something, wouldn't that make things worse? Not just for the store, but for people like her. People who were already battling against the assumptions others made about them. Maya didn't want to be part of that cycle, even if it meant helping someone who had hurt her. Her feet moved before her mind had fully made up its decision. She turned around and headed back toward the store, her steps quick and determined. As she reached the entrance, the bell jingled again, and Maya found herself standing in the doorway, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her. Emily was at the counter, talking to Mr. Howard. The store was quieter now, with just a few customers milling about, including the boy she had seen earlier. Maya's gaze swept the room, taking in the scene with fresh eyes. She could see the boy near the back of the store, his hand reaching for something on the shelf. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what he was doing. He was slipping small items into his jacket, moving quickly and discreetly. For a moment, Maya was frozen. She felt like she was watching a scene unfold in slow motion, each movement deliberate and calculated. Her heart pounded in her chest as she weighed her options. She could just leave, pretend she hadn't seen anything, walk away, and let whatever happened, happen. But that didn't sit right with her. She had always believed in doing the right thing, no matter how difficult it was. And in that moment, Maya knew she couldn't just stand by and let this happen. She walked up to the counter, her voice low and steady as she spoke to Emily. "There's someone in the back aisle. I think he's stealing." Emily's eyes widened in surprise, and for a brief second there was a flicker of disbelief. It was as though she couldn't quite process what Maya was telling her. Maya stood there, her pulse quickening, half expecting Emily to dismiss her. After all, why would she trust her now? But then, something shifted in Emily's expression, a hesitation followed by a wary glance toward the back of the store. "Are you sure?" Emily asked, her voice softer than before. Maya nodded. "I saw him take something just now." Mr. Howard, who had been standing nearby, overheard the conversation and frowned. His years of experience kicked in, and without another word, he moved toward the back of the store. Maya watched as he approached the boy, his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, son. Can I help you with something?" The boy froze, his hand still halfway inside his jacket. His eyes darted around the store, looking for an escape, but there was none. Mr. Howard gestured for him to remove whatever he had taken, and after a long, tense pause, the boy pulled a handful of small items from his jacket and placed them on the shelf. Emily stood frozen behind the counter, her eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold. She hadn't even noticed the boy before, too focused on following Maya earlier. The realization hit her hard, and for a moment she couldn't move, couldn't speak. All her attention had been on the wrong person. The boy mumbled an apology, his face flushed with embarrassment, and Mr. Howard escorted him out of the store. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the door closed behind him. Shh! The bell jingling one last time. Maya stood there, her heart still pounding in her chest, unsure of what to say or do. She hadn't done this to prove a point or to gain some sort of moral high ground. She had just done what she thought was right. But now, standing in front of Emily, who looked more shaken than anyone, Maya couldn't help but feel the weight of what had just happened. Emily's face was pale, her expression a mixture of shock and guilt. She glanced at Maya, and for the first time since the girl had entered the store, there was no suspicion in her eyes, only regret. Emily began, her voice faltering. "I'm sorry." Maya wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't expecting an apology, and she certainly wasn't sure how to respond to it. So instead, she just nodded, her emotions too tangled to untangle in that moment. Emily opened her mouth to say more, but the words caught in her throat. She had spent the entire afternoon assuming the worst about Maya, watching her every move, convinced that she was the one to watch out for. And in doing so, she had missed the real threat. The irony of it was almost too much to bear. Maya could see the conflict in Emily's face, the realization that her actions, her assumptions, had been completely wrong. It wasn't just the mistake that hurt Emily, it was the deeper truth that she had been blind to. The truth that Maya had done the very thing Emily should have done from the beginning, paid attention to the people who were actually doing something wrong. Maya gave a small, polite nod before turning to leave the store again, the cold air rushing in as the door opened behind her. This time, when she stepped outside, she felt a different kind of weight, one that wasn't entirely negative. She had done what was right, despite the unfair treatment she'd received, and that was something. But as she walked away, Maya couldn't help but wonder what might change the next time she came into the store. Would she still be judged? Would Emily treat her differently? Or would the cycle continue, unbroken, for the next person who looked like her? The bell above the door jingled softly as it closed behind Maya, the sound almost swallowed by the cold night air. Inside the store, Emily stood frozen, staring blankly at the back of the shop where the teenage boy had just been caught. The world felt like it had tilted off its axis, leaving her in a state of disorientation that she couldn't quite shake. The truth was undeniable, but the weight of it pressed down on her like a stone. She had spent the entire time watching Maya, convinced that her instincts were right, only to find out she had been focusing on the wrong person. The real shoplifter had been right there, under her nose, while she was too busy profiling the wrong person. Emily's hands gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white with tension. She wanted to move, to say something, to explain herself. But what could she say? What excuse was there for assuming the worst about Maya, simply because of how she looked? There was none. It was a mistake, and it was hers alone to bear. Mr. Howard approached from the back of the store, his face set in a deep frown, his usual calm demeanor replaced by the heavy burden of disappointment. He had been with Emily long enough to know when something was weighing on her. But this was different. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, and he could see that this incident had struck a nerve deeper than either of them had anticipated. As he reached the counter, Emily looked up at him, her face pale and her eyes wide with remorse. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them stretched on, filled with the unspoken weight of what had just transpired. "That could have gone much worse," Mr. Howard finally said, his voice low and measured. He glanced toward the door where the boy had left. "We've had problems before, but I didn't think it'd happen again so soon." Emily nodded slowly, but the words felt distant to her. It wasn't just about the boy who had stolen. It was about Maya, about what Emily had done, or rather, what she had failed to do. She had been so wrapped up in her assumptions that she hadn't seen what was right in front of her. "I didn't," Emily started to say, but her voice trailed off. She didn't know how to finish the sentence. How could she explain that she had spent the whole time suspecting the wrong person simply because of an ingrained bias she didn't even realize she had? How could she admit that she had been wrong, that she had let her prejudice cloud her judgment? Mr. Howard's eyes softened as he looked at her. He wasn't an unkind man, but he was someone who believed in hard truths. He had been in the business long enough to understand that mistakes happen, but he also knew that some mistakes carried more weight than others. "You were watching her, weren't you?" he asked quietly, though it wasn't really a question. The look on Emily's face was answer enough. Emily bit her lip and nodded again, the guilt rising in her chest like a tidal wave. "I was," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I thought she was going to." Mr. Howard sighed deeply, rubbing the back of his neck as he processed what she was saying. "It's easy to jump to conclusions," he said after a long pause. "Too easy sometimes. But that doesn't mean it's right." His words were calm, but they cut through Emily like a knife. She had known Mr. Howard for years, had worked with him since she was young, and had always respected him. Hearing the disappointment in his voice now felt like a punch to the gut. "I don't know why I did it," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't even realize. I wasn't thinking." Mr. Howard looked at her for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "It's not about whether you were thinking or not," he said finally. "It's about what's been planted in your head over time. Sometimes it's not even your own thoughts. It's what you've been taught to believe, what you've seen around you. And sometimes you don't even realize it's there until something like this happens." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She had never considered herself someone who judged others unfairly. She had grown up believing that she treated everyone equally, that she was open-minded, that she didn't hold on to the prejudices that others might. But now, standing here in the aftermath of her actions, she couldn't deny the truth anymore. "I was wrong," she said, the words feeling heavy as they left her mouth. "I shouldn't have assumed anything about her. I don't know why I did." Mr. Howard nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "The important thing is that you see it now," he said. "You can't change what's already happened, but you can learn from it. You can make sure it doesn't happen again." Emily looked down at the counter, her mind racing. She wanted to believe that it was that simple, that recognizing her mistake was enough to make it better. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The damage had already been done, and no amount of reflection could take that back. Her thoughts drifted to Maya, to the look on her face when she had quietly pointed out the real thief. Maya had known she was being watched, Emily was sure of that. And yet, despite the way she'd been treated, despite the suspicion she had felt coming from Emily, she had still chosen to do the right thing. She had still chosen to speak up. Maya's quiet strength in that moment haunted Emily. It was a reminder of just how much she had underestimated her, of how blind she had been to her own biases. Maya had been the one wronged, and yet she had acted with more integrity than Emily had shown the entire time. "I need to apologize," Emily said suddenly, her voice firm with conviction. Mr. Howard raised an eyebrow, his expression softening a little. "You do," he agreed. "But don't just apologize to make yourself feel better. Do it because it's the right thing to do." Emily nodded, his words sinking in. Apologizing wasn't about easing her own guilt. It was about acknowledging the harm she had caused, about taking responsibility for her actions. She didn't expect Maya to forgive her, but at the very least, she owed her the truth. The rest of the evening passed slowly, the store quieting down as the night deepened. Emily's mind never left the thought of Maya, the need to make amends growing stronger with each passing minute. She replayed the scene over and over in her head, the way Maya had stood so calmly, even as Emily's suspicion clung to her like a shadow. The way she had noticed the real thief, while Emily had been blinded by her assumptions. When the store finally closed for the night, Emily locked up and walked home in the dark. The streets were quiet, the city alive with the hum of distant traffic, but her mind was loud, a cacophony of thoughts and emotions that wouldn't settle. The weight of the day hung heavy on her shoulders, and she knew it would stay with her until she made things right. As she approached her apartment building, Emily stopped and looked up at the night sky, the stars barely visible through the city lights. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, and made a silent vow to herself. She wouldn't let this mistake define her. She would learn from it. She would be better. But most importantly, she would face the truth, not just about Maya, but about herself. The sun had barely risen when Maya decided to return to the store. She hadn't planned on going back so soon. Part of her didn't want to return at all. But the encounter from the previous evening lingered with her, nagging at her thoughts like a splinter that wouldn't go away. She had done the right thing by pointing out the shoplifter, and yet she couldn't shake the frustration of being unfairly targeted by Emily. Still, she wanted closure, something that would allow her to move forward without carrying the heavy burden of resentment. As she approached the store, Maya slowed her steps, taking in the familiar sights of the neighborhood. The morning air was crisp, cool against her skin, and she felt a certain calmness wash over her. The events of the previous day had been draining, emotionally and mentally. But today she felt more at peace, more ready to face whatever might happen next. Maya pushed the door open, and the now familiar chime of the bell signaled her arrival. She stepped inside, half expecting to feel the same tension she had felt the day before. But today, the store felt different. It was quieter, less oppressive. The shelves were neatly arranged, and the early morning light filtered in through the windows, casting a soft glow over the aisles. Emily was behind the counter again, her eyes scanning the room absent-mindedly until they landed on Maya. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Maya saw the flash of recognition in Emily's eyes, followed by something else: guilt. It was unmistakable, a shadow that passed over Emily's face as she stood there, her hands frozen mid-task. The tension between them was palpable, but this time it was different. This time, it wasn't suspicion that hung in the air, it was remorse. Emily hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the item she'd been holding back on the counter. Her heart raced in her chest, a mixture of anxiety and determination fueling her next move. She had spent all night replaying the events in her head, thinking of how to approach Maya, what to say, and how to make things right. But now that the moment had arrived, all those rehearsed words seemed to slip away. Maya walked slowly toward the counter, her eyes locking with Emily's. She could see the conflict in the woman's expression, the way her lips parted as though she was searching for the right words but couldn't quite find them. Maya wasn't sure what to expect, but she remained calm, her own emotions in check. She had already decided not to carry the bitterness with her. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same grace she had shown the day before. Emily swallowed hard, finally breaking the silence. "Maya," she said, her voice softer than usual, almost fragile. "Can we talk?" Maya tilted her head slightly, surprised that Emily had addressed her by name. She hadn't expected that. Nodding slowly, she approached the counter, her eyes studying Emily's face, searching for any hint of the tension that had been present the previous day. Emily took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. She faltered, her voice catching in her throat. "I need to apologize." The words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Emily's voice was laced with regret, and it was clear that the apology came from a place of genuine remorse. For a moment Maya said nothing, waiting for Emily to continue. "I was wrong," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. She kept her eyes on Maya, refusing to look away even though the guilt gnawed at her. "I shouldn't have treated you the way I did yesterday. I shouldn't have assumed." Her voice cracked, and she paused to collect herself. "I let my own biases get in the way, and I'm so sorry for that. You didn't deserve it." Maya stood there, listening to every word, absorbing the weight of Emily's apology. Part of her wanted to feel satisfied, to let Emily's guilt sink in and remind her of the hurt she had caused. But that wasn't who Maya was. She had spent too many years facing this kind of prejudice, too many moments carrying the burden of others' assumptions. She wasn't interested in revenge or holding on to anger. What she wanted was understanding. Understanding from Emily, from people like her, that this behavior had real consequences, that it wasn't just about suspicion or vigilance. It was about humanity. "I appreciate the apology," Maya said, her voice steady but firm. "But it's not just about what happened yesterday. It's about what led you to think I was someone to be watched in the first place." Emily flinched at the truth of Maya's words, her face flushing with shame. She knew Maya was right. The events of the previous day were just the tip of the iceberg. There were deeper issues at play. Issues that went beyond one moment of judgment. Emily had to confront the fact that her behavior was part of a larger problem, a problem that affected people like Maya every single day. "I know," Emily said quietly. "I've been thinking about that a lot since yesterday. I realize that I've been seeing things in people that aren't really there, judging people based on nothing but assumptions." She took another deep breath, her eyes filling with tears that she blinked back. "I don't want to be like that. I don't want to treat people that way." Maya's gaze softened slightly. She could see the sincerity in Emily's words, the genuine desire to change, and that, more than the apology itself, was what mattered to her. People made mistakes. Maya knew that better than anyone, but it was what they did after the mistake that defined them. "It's not easy," Maya said, her voice gentler now. "It's not just about being sorry, it's about being aware, about challenging those thoughts when they come up. It's about making sure you don't let those assumptions guide your actions." Emily nodded, wiping away the tear that had slipped down her cheek. "I know," she said softly, "and I'm going to work on that. I promise." For a long moment, the two women stood in silence, the tension that had once existed between them slowly melting away. Maya didn't need to hear any more. She could see that Emily was sincere, and that was enough for her. She didn't need an endless explanation or more apologies. What she needed was to know that Emily had learned something, that this moment would stay with her, and that she would carry it forward. Maya offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "We all make mistakes," she said. "What matters is that you learn from them." Emily nodded, her chest tight with emotion. She felt a sense of relief wash over her, knowing that Maya had accepted her apology, but more than that, knowing that Maya had given her something far more valuable, the opportunity to grow. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make it right." Maya didn't respond with words, but her eyes conveyed the message. She had no interest in holding grudges, no desire to carry the weight of anger or resentment. Life was already difficult enough without adding more burdens to it. She simply wanted to live in a world where she wasn't judged by the color of her skin, where people like Emily didn't see her as a threat just because of preconceived notions. With a final nod, Maya turned and walked toward the door. The bell jingled as she stepped outside, the morning sun casting a golden hue over the quiet street. As she walked away from the store, Maya felt lighter. She wasn't naive enough to think that this moment would change everything, that prejudice would suddenly vanish from the world. But it was a start, and sometimes that was all you could ask for. Inside the store, Emily stood behind the counter, her heart still racing, but this time it was filled with a different kind of energy. She had made a mistake, a serious one, but she had faced it. And now she had the chance to do better. She glanced toward the door where Maya had just left, her mind buzzing with the lessons of the past 24 hours. Emily knew there was still a long way to go, still so much work to be done, both within herself and in the world around her. But for the first time, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. It wasn't just about avoiding mistakes in the future. It was about actively confronting the biases that had taken root in her mind, about challenging the assumptions she had been taught to make. The store remained quiet for a while after Maya's departure, the morning slowly unfolding outside. Emily straightened the items on the counter, her mind more focused, her heart lighter. There was something different about the day, something that told her this was a new beginning, not just for her but for how she would choose to see the world from now on. And as the bell chimed once more, signaling the entrance of another customer, Emily greeted them with a genuine smile. A smile that was no longer weighed down by assumptions or judgments, but by the desire to truly see people for who they were. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.